We're seeing a growing amount of promise with the emergence of nonprofit news organizations. As opposed to for-profit media, nonprofit generally relies on less on the whims of advertising and circulation revenue in an open market, demands of stockholders, and instead realizes that journalism is an essential public service that preserves democracy, and so it's funded differently, often benefactors and foundations. Additionally, nonprofit journalism aims to build loyal, targeted audiences that serve communities that may not be commercially attractive, such as rural or less affluent communities. In number, nonprofit journalism is growing through small local outlets and other startups. The Institute of Nonprofit News represents more than 360 of these groups in North America. A recent survey showed that they're often about a third of them are less than 5 years old. They design their coverage around civic and social impact. And unlike ad-based media pursuing mass numbers, they aim to build loyal, targeted audiences or serve audiences that may not be commercially attractive. The volume of reporting among nonprofit journalism has grown substantially between 2017 and 2020. It's roughly doubled. They now produce about 1,000 stories a day. And employment opportunities within this sector are increasing as well. 2,700 or more working these days, up 17% from the year before. Nonprofit news is also dramatically growing its revenue. Nearly 2/3 of outlets with comparable data saw individual giving grow, and 6% saw grant funding gains. We see nonprofit journalism happening right here in Springfield. Capital News, Illinois, opened in January 2019 to help fill the gaps left behind by the number of news outlets that left the capital. And I covers the daily goings-on of state government and provides that coverage free of charge to newspapers and public radio stations throughout Illinois. The venture is backed by the Illinois Press Foundation and the McCormick Foundation. And you probably, if you read the State Journal-Register or other newspapers, you probably often see a Capital News Illinois byline every so often, helping to supplement the coverage that the SJR is doing. So the transformation of the news industry has altered how we've run the public affairs reporting program. My last few minutes here, I wanted to quickly review some of those changes. First, with much of the news audience consuming their content on a screen, we're demanding our journalists become, as they say, platform agnostic, meaning they can produce longer form stories for print or web and broadcast pieces that can go on the radio or TV. And on top of that, we stress the importance of data journalism and the ability to find stories within a collection of government data that they can then convey through a chart or a graph. That's starkly different than how the program used to run, when students, upon entering, basically had to declare at the beginning whether they were a print person or a broadcast person, and then they held that label for the rest of their lives. But we trained them that way. If you were a print person, you would go over here and you would write long print stories, and if you're a broadcast person, you learn how to write a 45-second radio script or a TV script. Now we're teaching students all of it. Students still have the ability. I mean, there's people like me who have a face for radio, or a face for newspapers. So, students like that, they are able to specialize, sort of kind of know that they're going to be a print journalist or a newspaper journalist. But we still expose them to some exercises that have them writing some radio scripts. So when it's time to get a job, they'll resume and be more versatile in the job market. We're also seeing, less reliance on what we call turn of the screw stories, doing stories about, menial, minor developments in a piece of legislation moving. We did back in my day, we were at every 8 a.m. committee meeting in the Senate and the House, covering, every, last little minute detail of how a bill was moving. Now, with fewer journalists, fewer pages to print their stories in, less time for everyone, we're focusing more on big picture stories. What does it all mean? Or digging into the effects of legislation or policies on average Illinoisans and sort of bringing that home with real life stories about how it's affecting, the single mom in Springfield or the mixed family in Chicago. And from a more practical standpoint, we have changed what a PAR internship looks like. Back in the day when the State House press room was packed with journalists, to assign students to be mentored by a professional journalist who sat in the same room as the student. We still have that experience in a majority of cases, but we have also added remote internships where the PAR student is at the Capitol working for a news agency, but they're generally by themselves down here, and then they do daily with an editor at the home office, whether that's in Chicago or Arlington Heights or elsewhere. And then when it comes to getting our students employed after graduation, we're encouraging them to be on traditional media. There's still a lot of jobs out there with newspapers and TV and radio, but the rise of alternative media, as Bud was talking about, and nonprofit media has increased the types and styles of journalism that you can make a living doing. So we encourage that as well. I wanted to close with one additional observation I've made about today's journalism students. The seismic changes that we've seen in journalism over the last 15 years or so. I know it gets older people like me and other longtime newspaper subscribers like many of you upset. And it leads to a lot of consternation when we're talking about printing the newspaper in a different city from where it's written and cutting back on home delivery and not being able to get those city council stories in the printed newspaper the next day because the deadline was so early. Those things, those changes that make the older crowd feel upset, sad, or nostalgic, or whatever, those things hardly resonate with my students. Because if you think about it, many of my students are in their early 20s, which means when these cutbacks started to happen, they were in first or second grade. And now they consume all of their news on a phone. So the tradition of opening the morning newspaper with their coffee to get their news is in cases a completely unfamiliar scenario for them. So they are unfazed by early print deadlines and no Saturday deliveries because they know there are no deadlines or home deliveries when you're talking about the internet. They're most concerned about doing important work that holds government accountable and helps citizens understand what their elected officials are doing. I was talking to some undergraduate student journalists at Illinois State University a couple weeks ago, and it's the message I also want to leave you with today. I told them that their generation's status as digital natives, people who have literally grown up with phones in their hands, will allow them, perhaps more than any other generation, to help us establish a solid economic model for local news that is sustainable and serves audiences everywhere with intelligent and trustworthy reporting about their communities. So it is that belief that gives me hope for the future, that responsible journalism that makes society stronger and smarter will survive. We still have a long way to go to get there. We can't stop. The foundations of our democracy depend on it. Thank you.